Hello! Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of Mildly Interesting, a deep dive session. Today, we'll be talking about a hot topic that's been circulating the news recently: gun control and gun reform in America. If you like what we do, obviously go give us a follow on the social medias. We do Instagram and Twitter. Do check out the website. Santos spent a lot of time on it, and it does show he put a lot of effort into it. And obviously give us a follow on Spotify for all the latest episodes, as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. Without further ado, I'm Akash Lush.
And I'm John Santos.
And this is Mildly Interesting Deep Dives.
Mildly interesting. No, seriously, just mildly interesting.
In the wake of the mass shootings that have gone out through the year, we would attempt to name them all, but we genuinely can't, because according to the definition of a mass shooting, it is classed as a shooting incident when at least 4 people are injured or killed, excluding the attacker. By this definition, America has gone through more mass shootings this year than days, which is insane. America has already gone through 200 plus mass shootings, and obviously the newest ones, I mean, there's probably already another one that makes the news before this comes out, but the newest ones have been the shooting at the elementary school in Texas, Uvalde, as well as the shooting in supermarket in a predominantly black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York, where 10 people were killed in the supermarket and 19 people were killed in the elementary school shooting in Texas. And as thoughts and prayers makes their rounds on social media, the question on everyone's mind that comes up again and again but never seems to be practically solved is, how do Americans let this keep happening? And obviously this isn't, it sounds like an accusatory statement. You know, we're saying that, it's their own fault that, these mass shootings happen, but to some extent, the data supports this. While calculating the number of guns in private hands around the world is difficult, figures from the Small Arms Survey, a Swiss-based leading research project, estimates that there were 390 million guns in circulation in 2018 in America. This equates to 120.5 firearms per 100 residents, surpassing every other country. Not only are there more guns than citizens in America, there are more privately owned guns than citizens in America. And this figure keeps growing. A more recent study published by the Annals of Internal Medicine in February found that 7.5 million US adults became first new gun owners between January 2019 and April 2021. At the same time, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, reported that a total number of 45,222 people died from gun-related injuries of all causes during 2020, the most in the world. So we have figures that clearly show that the abundance of gun ownership in America somewhat correlates with their outlying data of gun violence and gun deaths as compared to every other country. So how does this continue? How is gun culture in America still so strong? And why is gun reform, or even the debate over gun control, still so weak? Santos, why don't we give them sort of a brief history about where America's gun culture stems from? And specifically, I think the holy grail, I guess the holy document of gun lobbyists, especially the NRA, which is the Second Amendment.
Yeah, so we do have to sort of go through the Second Amendment first. Even though of all the amendments, this one for me is really weird. But so the Second Amendment goes, and I quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, there are two main interpretations that I could find to justify or not justify gun ownership and gun reform. The first one speaks to the individual right to own a firearm. And since the early 20th century, the main argument for this has been in relation to self-defense, mainly through guns. This interpretation, and which is by far the most widespread, stems from America's long history of revolution despite its short existence as a nation, where the founding fathers are believed to have thought that individuals should have the right not only to defend themselves against threats, but also against tyranny from the state. This would mean that legislative bodies would be forbidden from regulating gun ownership, as it would infringe the rights of self-defense. Sort of, you can't defend yourself without guns kind of thing, which is really the most American thing I've ever heard in my life. The second interpretation, on the other hand, does not focus on the individual right to own a gun, but focus rather on the well-regulated militia part of the amendment, which would be sort of like the collective right to self-defense. So in this interpretation, people would still reserve their right to self-defense, but the state would have the power to regulate firearms because self-defense is not connected to firearms per se. So regardless, we do have to say that at the time of writing the amendment, the gun of choice was a musket. So these were guns that could fire about 3 rounds a minute and had power to go about 50 meters in the right hands. So this is like a bee sting compared to the firepower in guns nowadays. People nowadays are able to buy military-style guns at the age of 18. Not muskets that can fire 3 rounds a minute. And more often than not, jam when you're trying to fire them.
It is quite entrenched in American history, as well as the Constitution itself, as about gun ownership and Americans owning guns. The founding fathers, especially James Madison, considered the father of the Constitution himself, said that the monopoly on guns by the monarchies of Europe and their armies was the very source of oppression that the American colonialists were fighting. But obviously they still recognized that, they recognized the idea that more privately owned guns could just increase frontier lawlessness, because at this point, America was still just the 13 colonies. The Second Amendment is the compromise between that. And this spawned Gun Culture 1.0, which is, as Wake Forest University professor David Yemaine describes it, was about guns as critical tools for pioneers hunting game and fending off varmints, which, by the way, varmint, very, I think, a very American word, as well as, and on a darker tone, as well as the genocidal conquest of Native Americans and the control of slaves. So guns were used as a tool. It's strange because gun ownership was seen as a tool of subversiveness, a tool of overthrowing oppression. But then the way guns were used in colonial America were somewhat oppressive. Hunting, I guess, in cases of the frontier, like in cases of frontier outposts, self-defense, but also taking land from Native Americans and controlling slavery. Now, while this fueled the early days of American gun culture, as America modernized and urbanized, gun makers saw flat sales due to the steep decline of hunting and shooting sports by the 1990s, and obviously, the genocide of the Native Americans and the control of slaves were a thing of the past. So, Gun Culture 1.0 was very much dead by the 1990s. But this paved the way for Gun Culture 2.0, which is described as, I think, what you touched on, which is you need guns to protect yourself. The NRA, National Rifle Association, and the gun industry began telling consumers that they needed personal firearms to protect themselves. Gun marketing increasingly showed people under attack from rioters and thieves and hyped the need for personal tactical equipment. And while gun control is a very politicized debate, with sort of it being drawn down by Democrats wanting more gun reform and Republicans kind of Republicans refusing to accept gun control, as well as it's quite, there are some racial undertones as well. It was noted that the rise of racial tensions, as well as anti-immigrant sentiments and white supremacy sentiments, the rise of those also trended with the rise of personal handgun sales. So while this debate is highly quite politicized, as well as it seems to be drawn down on racial lines, it is important to note that people of all different types of backgrounds tend to buy guns after there is a mass shooting, because there is this widespread gun culture, the idea that if someone else has a gun, you need a gun to defend yourself. And while the trend of violent crime in general has tended to be downward for the past 2 decades, gun-related murders are pretty much the only violent crime that has seen a resurgence. And this all has contributed to this new gun culture and giving a sharp boost to personal firearm sales. But obviously, so that's kind of what we're working with. We were working with the idea that personal gun ownership was seen as subversive to more of this personal protection, this gun is my safety kind of thinking. But Santos, how has gun reform evolved throughout the years? Because obviously there's been a shift in gun culture. What kind of shifts have we seen when it comes to legislation on gun control?
So here's the thing, though. When it comes to gun reform, it's such a tense topic in American politics that most presidents don't even attempt to approach it. In fact, the last time anything significant happened to gun law was a whole 14 years ago, in 2008, where the U.S. Supreme Court in the District of Columbia v. Heller cemented gun ownership as a fundamental right. Previous gun laws have also liberalized gun ownership. For instance, in 2003, the Tiahrt, I suppose it's the name, the Tiahrt Amendment made it so that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives could not show data of where criminals buy their firearms, with only law enforcement and prosecutors able to access that information. Sort of private citizens, for instance, could not access that information, which, I suppose you could argue brings forth all the debates on being transparent, right? Then, in 2005, so we're just going backwards from here, because since 2008, nothing significant really has happened. But in 2005, George W. Bush signed the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which shielded gun manufacturers from being sued in federal or state civil suits by those victims of guns made by that company, shifting from the gun ownership part of the equation, which is really what we're trying to talk about here, to gun usage. So the focus is not on what guns are and whether the common person should have access to those guns, but on how they're used. So it's that old argument again, is not the guns that kill people, it's the people that kill people. And that is what is behind gun legislation over the past 20 years, really, is that people kill people, and therefore guns are not the issue, and therefore liberalizing guns is something that is not a problem.
Yeah, and we've seen there's been a real disconnect between the public concerns and what's happening in Washington. Over time, we've seen that Americans support some sort of gun control, and this is across the spectrum. So, a Gallup poll in 1959 showed that 60% of Americans supported a complete ban on personal handguns. And more recent surveys have shown that at least 80% of Americans wish to have stricter background check rules when purchasing firearms. But there's always been something in the way of these gun control, and that mostly has been gun rights lobbyists and the NRA. So the NRA is the National Rifle Association. think of, in the words of John Oliver, imagine PETA but for guns, and they actually do something. So the NRA has supported politicians who go against gun control, as well as has successfully lobbied for laws to support the rights of personal handgun owners. For example, like you said, nothing big since 2008 has happened in gun control, really. In 2013, a bill was proposed to the US Senate called the Manchin-Toomey Amendment. And this was in the wake, I believe, of the Sandy Hook shooting. It wasn't even that big. It just proposed background checks on gun show and online gun sales. That's it. That was like the biggest gun control that it proposed. It even had some pro gun sales laws in there. For example, the Manchin-Toomey Amendment also allowed firearm dealers, for the first time since 1968, to sell across state lines. So it wasn't even a gun control bill. It was just, it had a gun control law in there, but then there were also some parts that were pro-gun selling. But even though Manchin himself, the guy who co-signed the amendment, was supported by the NRA, and even though he tried to appease them by putting in stuff that would support gun sellers, the bill died. The bill died. The NRA pulled their support on Manchin and even released attack ads on him in his own state. And I think we also, talking about gun reform, I think the biggest argument against gun control is the idea that there is no research supporting the fact that increased stricter gun control could lead to less gun violence. And there is a real reason for this. In 1996, the NRA successfully lobbied Congress to put a restriction on the CDC's budget, the US association which is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In 1996, they put a amendment to their budget through the Dickey Amendment. And it was simply the idea that none of the funds made available may be used to advocate or promote gun control. Funding into research on gun control violence by the CDC dropped by 96%. Out of the $5.6 billion the CDC was allocated in 2013, only $100,000 could be used to research gun violence. So not only does America have tight laws and funding restrictions on those regulating guns, such as the ATF, but they also have funding. They've also pushed through funding blocks and tight restrictions on those even trying to just research the concept of gun reform. In the most recent years, we have seen some improvement. In 2020, there was a bill passed that included $25 million for gun violence research to be split evenly between the CDC and the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. But obviously they're still trying to play catch up on 20 years worth of research, 20 plus years of research that they've missed out on evidence that could have supported gun reforms. So obviously Santos has mentioned the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, the ATF, which I think should be the coolest department of the should be the coolest organization of the Justice Department. It's everything cool. However, so they are responsible for licensing federal firearm licenses and using the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System and inspecting gun dealers for compliance with the law. And obviously, all of this ties into cracking down on illegal gun sales. Now, not only are they crippled because there's no comprehensive federal law against gun trafficking, but Congress over the years has tacked on what are called riders, or bits of permanent law tacked on to an appropriations bill to the ATF's funding. And I think you mentioned this already. Some of them were called the Tia Hurt amendments.
Yep.
And it's astounding how restrictive they've made the ATF, because not only on top of what you've already mentioned, the ATF is so weak, like, they can't even strip licenses from gun dealers effectively. Because what they have to do, they don't... So, if you're a gun dealer in America, and you break the law, that's not enough to have your your firearm dealing license restricted. Because what the ATF has to do is not only do they have to prove that you broke the law, but they have to prove that you broke the law knowing it, and you broke the law on purpose. If they don't have the evidence to show that you willingly broke the law, that with the knowledge that what you're doing is illegal, they cannot... It is near impossible to prosecute an individual or a store. And you would think then, oh, well, you could just give these responsibilities to another organization. No, because some of the TR amendments even block funding to reassign ATF responsibilities to other departments. So I think Santos and I, while researching this, we could not believe how incredibly corrupted this all sounds. The idea that gun lobbyists and the politicians they support have just been able to have a chokehold on the people who could enforce gun control or the people who could research evidence into it. But obviously, we're talking about kind of the past. We're kind of talking about how reform has evolved over time. Where are we now, Santos? What is the general legislation behind gun rights? So sort of like, I guess, federal and state level. And what are some of the current proposed bills that can realistically, with the Senate and the House of Representatives as we know it, kind of get passed?
Just a little side note from this Deep Dives episode to say that since the recording of it, the US government has finally managed to pass the first gun reform legislation in nearly 30 years, which includes tougher background checks for buyers younger than 21, $15 billion in federal funding for mental health programs and school security upgrades, funding to encourage states to implement red flag laws to remove firearms from people considered a threat, and closing the so-called boyfriend loophole. So this is essentially a loophole that would allow people convicted of abusing unmarried intimate partners guns. So this essentially blocks those sales. At first glance, this is at least an improvement on the situation, but the debate is obviously not done around this subject. So do keep listening, as we will outline a lot more information around this debate. To your first question, where are we now? Nowhere, really.
I think that sums it up.
Yeah. If there are any type of legislation that might get through, very unlikely. We have just come out of the woodwork with after two mass shootings, and the debate did go on for about a week, and nothing's going to happen. President Biden paid his respects. All the other politicians paid their respects, and then it's just gonna die down until the next mass shooting. That's how gun reform happens in the U.S. As for the legislation that is on the ground or that was just recently rejected, there are two that were very, very recently rejected. That's S.3387, which is a bill that mandated that the FBI does not delete unfinished background checks, which, in my European mind, just sounds like something that should be a given anyway. It sounds like if you don't finish a background check, at least it should be publicly accessed, or at least not deleted.
It's not... Yeah, that's wild to me. It's not just like... If you can't find something, your first instinct, or it should not be legal to just be like, they're probably innocent, and then just delete it. Like
exactly.
No.
Exactly. That's literally what the bill was about. And on that topic, actually, I should explain that the FBI, through the NICS, is the organization responsible for background checks. And at the moment, they essentially have 3 days to conduct those background checks. So if that sounds like a small amount of time, that's because it is a small amount of time. And In 2020 alone, this led to 316,000 background checks not being completed whatsoever. And in fact, there's a bill called the HR 1446. So that's the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2021, which advocates that the 3-day window should be at least a 10-day window. So this bill is still pending in the Senate, but like all bills pending in the Senate, it's very likely to either stay pending in the Senate or just die in the Senate. Other than that, there has been the HR 8 bill, which established new background checks between private parties. So not just for licensed sellers, because at the moment, the way it works is only those with a license to sell guns need to do a background check by law. But if it's me selling a gun to someone else, then I don't need to do a background check. This bill would make it so that I would also need to do that background check and make sure that that person does not, suffer from psychosis or has killed people in the past, maybe. So that's really where we are, and well, we're nowhere really. But have you found any other sort of like general legislation?
It seems like, unlike many federal laws, state gun laws are actually mandated by state-level governments. We've already talked, while talking about the ATF, we mentioned that there's no real federal law concerning gun trafficking. Well, when you hear the term federal firearms laws, you might be under the assumption that it is required that citizens abide by them, because, they're federal laws. However, this is actually not the case. As the result of a court case between Prince and the United States government, the Supreme Court justices ruled that local state governments do not have to uphold and enforce the firearms laws of the federal government. 40 of the 50 states in the US have something in place that protects their residents' access to the Second Amendment. So, it seems like gun laws, at least in its current state, is very much a state-level issue, with states having various mixtures of different aspects of gun control. For example, the act of carrying firearms in the US can be defined in two different ways. So there's concealed carry, where the firearm is not visible, or open carry, where the firearm is displayed for the general public to see. And their states can determine whether or not you need a permit to carry weapons in public spaces. I think, though, a key thing to note is that states cannot explicitly deny citizens the right to bear arms or the right to purchase firearms, because again, it's technically illegal given the nature of the US Constitution, specifically interpretations of the Second Amendment. But usually states go about this by they find a loophole in the system by making the application process. So they require you a permit to purchase a firearm, and a permit to hold a firearm, and a permit to use to carry a firearm in public places. And they can make the application process so unpleasant and lengthy that most people, it effectively is a ban on guns, because most people just don't want to go through that process. So talking about states, 7 states completely ban open carry. 8 states require that people register their firearms, which, again, shocking that only 8 out of 50 states require you to, register your fucking murder weapon with the government. And 27 states, so just over half, enforce the Stand Your Ground law, which we could get into, but essentially, briefly, Stand Your Ground permits people to use deadly force if it is under the category of self-defense. As a law, it's quite loosely defined, which is why it's become quite controversial, but basically, if there's an intruder in your house, if there are trespassers on your property, if they are not, specifically, there is something in the law that states if they're not an officer on duty, if you have reason to believe that them getting to you would cause significant harm to you or people around you, you are allowed it is legal to shoot them. So obviously we could spend hours breaking down each of the 50 states and what kind of gun control they have, but I think it's better to do it on a spectrum. So states like New York and New Jersey, they require firearm registration, a permit to carry that firearm, and a permit required to initially purchase it. And both states ban open carry. So those are considered more kind of stricter gun states. The other end of that spectrum are states like Wyoming, where they don't require any of the permits or regulations I just mentioned, and also allow you to just openly carry your gun. Now, it's important to note the top 10 states in terms of gun violence: Alaska, Alabama, Montana, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, Wyoming, West Virginia, and New Mexico. The states I just mentioned have the worst gun violence in the US. They're the top 10. Coincidentally, you do not need a permit to purchase a gun. You do not need to register that gun if you purchase it with the state. And most of those states, if not all of them, permit open carry. Some of those states require you to have a permit to carry it into public spaces. But like I said, there's no regulation on purchasing it, and there's no regulation concerning the registration of that weapon.
It's like just the fact that you either allow concealed or open carry in some states is mind-boggling to me. Because the whole idea behind it is that a criminal will not attack you if he thinks that you might have a gun. But that's literally fear-mongering. That's literally you walking down the street thinking that anyone that you cross might have a gun at any point in the day.
And like I said, there is no federal gun law, or at least concerning the things that I just mentioned, that is mandatory for the states to enforce.
So do you think gun reform should be a federal matter?
Like we've said, gun control is a heavily politicized debate, where it seems like Democrats would prefer tighter gun control, and Republicans, who some are given generous donations by the NRA, some of them, Republicans generally want looser gun control. And when you base it on that, gun reform is a state matter, because the states that are widely held by Republicans are shown to have looser gun laws than states widely sort of in the hands of Democrats. Whether it should be a federal matter or a state matter, to me, there is no argument. Like, there's no question about it. It has to be a federal matter. When you bring federal laws into effect, it makes organizations like the ATF, it makes their job a lot easier and a lot more effective. Because right now, they're juggling between different states and their different laws, and they have to treat each state differently on top of the burden of funding that we've already talked about. And on top of that, like I just said, it seems like the top 10 states are the most loosely regulated gun states in America. So it's not scientific evidence. Like, everyone can look at a graph and see looser gun laws, the states with looser gun laws coincide with the states with more gun violence. But that has to be some evidence that there needs to be a federal law in place so that every state can see a decline in gun violence.
You think that's realistic?
No, no, which is why I think will continue to be a state matter, because it's still very much portrayed as like a Democrats versus Republican issue. There's been some bipartisan efforts, but it seems like there are, whenever a line is drawn between those who support stricter gun control and those who don't, it seems that it's split down party lines. And it's one thing to introduce gun legislation, but it's an entirely new thing to convince local states populations who are already so inherently sold that having a gun is their American right, that it is what makes them American, that gun culture 2.0 is so deeply rooted in these communities. Passing federal legislation probably won't change their minds or change the idea of gun ownership. It seems like while it should be a federally mandated thing, to have real change, it needs to start from like the ground up. So with local communities realizing that more gun ownership, believe it or not, leads to more gun violence.
I think you touched on a good point earlier as well, that you said the ATF is now trying to juggle different laws in different states. So I think you kind of have to understand the US as a conglomerate of countries almost, where states differ greatly in the way they function, not only in gun reform, but like in other matters as well. So I don't, like you said, I don't think it's even possible to properly do gun reform on a federal level. Although, like you, I would also think that it would be good to avoid a whole array of consequences, and other than the ones you mentioned. For instance, interstate migration solely based on gun law is a very silly but real possibility. So people changing states simply because of gun law. And if you think this is stupid, that is what's happening, for instance, with abortion, with people moving to states where abortion is legal. So if anything were to get through, like you said, I believe it can only be on a state level. So, and this would probably look like, in my opinion, it probably look like gun reform being applied in more Democrat-led states, putting pressure on those who agree with it on more Republican states, so that people who agree with gun reform on Republican states would then, by seeing other states sort of like be stricter on gun reform, maybe pressure their governments into raising certain issues to light, I suppose. It would be, hopefully, blue states being stricter on gun reform, and those who agree with gun reform on red states hopefully pressuring their governments to do so. But you've also touched on a very good point, which is the fact that gun reform would not solve the problem. So if it doesn't, why does it not solve the problem if some data, at least, actually, if a lot of data at least points to the fact that there's a correlation between gun ownership and gun violence? And we can sit here and argue that correlation does not mean causation, but I would probably argue that in this case it probably does. So why would it not solve the problem, and how can the problem be solved then?
It's so interesting to me whenever we talk about ways to solve America.
Ways to solve America. we should make a movie about that.
Because from the outside looking in, America's problems seem so inherently like American. Like, how do you get a, like, I think some Americans are just famous for just not listening to the data. Because we've talked about how guns in America is such a politicized debate. So if you were to give someone these stats, they would only agree with it if it agrees with their political views. And I think the first step forward is probably depoliticizing the idea, the whole debate over gun reform. Because in America, it's so toxic. It's just, these stats were, manufactured by the Democrats to support their bill, or these facts were manufactured by the Republicans to, kill this bill. And it's just, there needs to be a point where we can convince Americans that this is not a political debate. This is an epidemic. So many Americans have this deep-rooted feeling or belief that their right to carry guns equates to their right to be American. And talking about how to solve that, you're essentially asking people to go into people's homes and like almost like preach to them, or like counter preach, if you will, that owning a gun doesn't make you American, and having gun control doesn't make the country any less American. All we're asking really is for federal laws concerning guns, so that every state has some standard on how guns are licensed or how they're regulated, as well as sort of background checks on all types of gun purchases, not just guns purchased online or at a gun show. All types of gun purchases should be background checked and registered with the state. Because if this state doesn't know who has a gun, how are we supposed to stop the next school shooter? How are we supposed to, if we cannot regulate, because it's always the idea that if a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with it. When has that worked? When gun ownership has spiked through the roof, when did the mass shooting stop? They haven't. And it's hard because we can see that, but people mostly part of the NRA or people in the deep red states, they can't see that for some reason. So not only I feel like there has to be work at a governmental, at a federal level, it's almost like they have to work individual by individual, and that's tough.
There are other ways of also of gun reform that we haven't mentioned. For instance, banning weapons of war. So while this probably wouldn't decrease gun deaths, if you can buy a semi-automatic machine gun, for instance, it probably would. To buying a pistol probably wouldn't decrease gun deaths in general, or decrease gun violence, but it would at least decrease the mortality of America's mass shootings, which is already something to strive for, I suppose. You could increase the age to buy a gun. So right now, in many states, of which Texas is a prime example, by the way, as evidenced by Uvalde, you only need to be 18 to buy a gun. And let me remind you that you need to be 21 to drink beer, but only 18 to buy and to own your very own deadly weapon. But
disgusting.
I do think, though, that there is a certain degree of weight to the Republican argument of it's not guns that kill people, it's people that kill people. I don't think they're trying to argue the fact, what I'm about to say, but I say that there's some weight to it because gun violence is correlated as well with mental illness and mental health, for instance, and other economic and social conditions. So the fact is that the main driver of people to become violent criminals is the fact that they already live in dire conditions. So which can be prevented through social help of the kind we discussed within the police reform episode, or economic aid like the child poverty law that was passed by Joe Biden, which, by the way, I'm off the topic a little bit, but I do think that's probably the best piece of legislation that he mandated and he got passed in his term. The problem is that pro-gun activists only focus on the gun side of the problem, and rightly so if you ask me, because anti-gun activists do so as well. So if you're focusing only on guns, you end up forgetting to mention all these other problems that associated with guns. So the fact is, if you do ban guns, you still have more guns than people already in circulation. If you do ban guns, it's not going to completely reverse the gun violence trend that we've been witnessing. It's gonna dim the trend. It's gonna I suppose like it's gonna flatten the curve in COVID terms, I suppose you could call it. But there are a whole other topics to look into, such as mental health and economic disparities, especially in poor neighborhoods where minorities are disproportionately affected by this. So we have to focus on gun reform, yes, but we do also have to focus on a whole range of other things.
And that was another deep dive into the hot topic of gun reform. Hope you all enjoyed it, and as always, we hope you were mildly interested. If you like what we do, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Check out the website, mildly-interesting.co.uk. We've got some articles. Follow us on Spotify. If you don't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit that bell so you know when the latest videos come out. But without further ado, I'm Akash Lush.
And I was John Sunch.
And this was Mildly Interesting Deep Dives.
Mildly interesting. No, seriously, just mildly interesting.